The copper coin hit the mahogany table with a heavy thud. Uncle Vance pushed it across the polished wood, his gold rings clicking against the surface. The flickering light from the dining room chandelier caught the smug grin spreading across his face. Around the table, my cousins stifled their giggles behind crystal wine glasses. "There you go, Clara," Vance sneered, tapping the rim of his plate with a silver fork. "One single dollar. That is your grand inheritance. Don't spend it all in one place. Maybe you can buy a cheap coffee on your way out tomorrow morning when the moving trucks arrive to pack up your little bedroom." I did not blink. I stared at the scarred copper coin resting next to my untouched porcelain saucer. The dining room was dead quiet, waiting for my tears. Instead, I picked up the dollar, slid it into my pocket, and looked my uncle dead in the eyes. "I do not need your dollar, Uncle Vance, because grandfather did not leave me the estate in his will," I said softly, my voice cutting through the thick silence. "He already signed the master deed over to me 2 years ago. To understand how we got here, we have to rewind 3 weeks earlier." The rain was beating furiously against the stone walls of Crest. My grandfather had passed away only 2 days prior, but the massive house demanded constant attention. The estate spanned 400 acres of dense pine forest, featuring a sprawling 3-story manor that required immense discipline to maintain. I stood in the grand foyer, holding a wooden clipboard. The head groundskeeper, Elias, approached me, wringing his hat in his hands. "Miss Clara, the Western Ridge fencing collapsed in the storm," Elias reported, his eyes lowered in mourning. "Should we wait until after the services to call the repair crews?" "No, Elias," I replied, signing a work order with my pen. "Grandfather hated neglected perimeters. Get the crews out there by noon. We maintain the discipline he taught us." I stood alone in the quiet hall. I had spent the last 5 years acting as grandfather's sole caretaker and estate manager. The rest of the family, my Uncle Vance and his 2 daughters, had not visited in over a decade. They hated the isolation of the woods. They hated the strict rules of the house. Suddenly, the heavy brass knocker slammed against the front door. The postman handed me an overnight certified envelope. The sender was Uncle Vance. I tore it open. It was a formal demand to cease all financial activities, claiming he was the sole heir. Vance was entirely certain he was about to inherit the empire. Why was he so confident? 10 years ago, during a brief hospital visit, Vance had snooped through grandfather's study and found an unsigned, outdated draft of a will leaving the estate to his only son. Vance never stayed long enough to see the final, legal documents drawn up by the attorneys. He thought I was just a glorified maid, a distant granddaughter who wiped counters and answered phones for free rent. I folded the threatening letter and slipped it into my pocket. I felt a familiar calmness wash over me. I walked down the long corridor toward the east wing. My footsteps made no sound on the thick Persian runners. Grandfather always said that true power was quiet. It did not need to shout. I entered the library and approached the large iron safe securely bolted beneath the heavy oak desk. I spun the metal dial, inputting the 6-digit code. The door clicked open. Inside sat a pristine leather folder. I knew exactly what was inside, but my quiet reflection was shattered by the sound of tires crunching violently outside. I locked the safe quickly and hurried to the bay window. A sleek black SUV was parked aggressively on the front lawn, crushing a bed of delicate white roses. 2 men in sharp business suits stepped out, holding digital tablets and measuring tapes. They were commercial real estate appraisers. I walked out the front doors, the cold wind whipping my coat. "Can I help you?" I asked firmly. The taller man barely looked at me. "We are here on behalf of Mr. Vance. We need to measure the exterior dimensions for the upcoming subdivision project. He plans to bulldoze the east wing and sell the land to developers." A cold fury tightened my chest. Vance was already planning to destroy Crest before the funeral even happened. He had absolutely no respect for the legacy my grandfather built. "You are trespassing on private property," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Leave immediately." The man chuckled, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. "Look, lady, the new owner gave us authorization. We are just doing our jobs." I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the local sheriff. I held the screen up so they could see the numbers clearly. "You have 60 seconds before I press call, and the nearest patrol car is parked just down the road at the diner. Leave." Recognizing I was not bluffing, they grabbed their measuring tapes, climbed back into the SUV, and sped off, leaving deep, muddy trenches in the lawn. I watched the red taillights disappear. Vance was coming to erase everything. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was Mr. Sterling, the family lawyer. "Clara?" His raspy voice sounded tired. "Vance just called my office. He is arriving at the estate on Friday evening. He demanded a formal dinner and a reading of the preliminary assets." "I know," I replied softly. "He sent appraisers to the house today. I chased them off." Mr. Sterling sighed heavily through the speaker. "He is walking into this completely blind, Clara. He is practically foaming at the mouth for control. Do you want me to tell him the truth before he arrives?" I looked back at the sprawling stone manor. I thought about the decades of neglect, the missed birthdays, and the sheer arrogance of a man who believed he could claim a kingdom he never earned. Grandfather wanted him to learn a final lesson about respect. "No, Mr. Sterling," I answered, the cold wind biting my cheeks. "Let him come on Friday. Let him have his dinner. I will serve him myself." The days leading up to Friday were a master class in discipline. Cresthaven was not just a house, it was a living, breathing testament to my grandfather's exacting standards. He built his fortune in timber, turning a small lumber yard into a massive regional supplier. But he never flaunted his wealth. He wore the same heavy canvas coats until they frayed and drove a reliable, boxy truck for 20 years. To him, respect was earned through hard work, not bought with flashy displays. Uncle Vance was the exact opposite. He despised the smell of sawdust and the quiet isolation of the woods. He fled to the city the moment he turned 18, chasing quick money and high society status. For over a decade, Vance only called when he needed a loan to cover his failing investment schemes. Grandfather finally cut him off 5 years ago. That was the exact same year I moved into Cresthaven to take over grandfather's care. His health was failing, and the massive estate required constant attention. I managed the staff, balanced the ledgers, and sat by his bed during the long, painful nights. Vance never visited once. Now, Vance had demanded this Friday dinner as a formal transition of power. He wanted Mr. Sterling, the family lawyer, to read the preliminary assets right in the formal dining room, treating it like a coronation. I spent the morning preparing the house, making sure every floorboard was polished and every window was spotless. Not for Vance, but to honor the estate. At exactly 4 o'clock, the roar of a high-performance engine shattered the afternoon peace. I stepped out onto the sprawling stone porch. A gleaming silver sports SUV tore up the long gravel driveway, kicking up a cloud of white dust. It swerved sharply before slamming to a halt right in front of the main steps. The doors swung open, and Uncle Vance stepped out, adjusting the collar of a custom-tailored navy suit. Following closely behind him were his 2 daughters, Lexi and Mia, both tapping frantically on their expensive phones, shivering in the crisp autumn air. "Look at this place," Vance muttered, his eyes raking over the stone facade with greedy hunger. "It looks like a haunted museum. The developers are going to have a field day knocking this dinosaur down." I stood at the top of the stairs, my hands clasped in front of me. "Good afternoon, Uncle Vance. Lexi, Mia. Welcome back to Cresthaven." Vance did not even look me in the eye. He marched up the steps, unbuttoning his suit jacket. As he passed me, he casually tossed his heavy leather weekender bag right at my chest. I caught it out of pure reflex, the heavy brass buckles digging into my palms. "Take that up to the master suite, Clara," Vance ordered, not breaking his stride as he walked through the grand front doors. "And tell the kitchen staff I want dinner served exactly at 7. The lawyer is arriving at 7:30. I do not want the meal interrupting the business." He was treating me exactly as he always had, like a hired servant. He genuinely believed my only role here was folding linens and pouring tea. "There is no kitchen staff, Uncle Vance," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even. "I am cooking the dinner myself." Lexi scoffed, stepping past me in her designer heels. "Well, make sure the chicken isn't dry this time. And grab my bags from the trunk, will you? The pink ones." A sharp flare of anger ignited in my chest, but I quickly smothered it. Discipline. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. I did not argue. I did not correct them. I simply carried Vance's heavy leather bag and Lexi's pink suitcases up the grand sweeping staircase. Let them believe the lie for a few more hours. Let them dig their own graves with their arrogance. When I reached the second-floor landing, I heard the sharp click of a door handle rattling. I dropped the bags and quickly turned the corner. Lexi was jiggling the ornate brass handle of grandfather's private study, the room adjacent to the master suite. Her face was twisted in frustration. "Why is this locked?" she whined, turning to her father. "I wanted to check the square footage in here for my new walk-in closet." Vance frowned, marching down the hallway toward us. "Clara, where is the key to this door? Open it up. We need to start cataloging the antique furniture for the estate auction." My heart hammered against my ribs, but my posture remained rigid. That study held the iron safe. It held the truth. And beyond that, it was grandfather's sanctuary. They had no right to violate it before the dust had even settled on his grave. "That room remains locked until the legal proceedings are entirely concluded," I stated, stepping squarely between Vance and the heavy oak door. It was grandfather's strict instruction. Vance stepped close, using his height to try and intimidate me. His cologne was overpowering, smelling of sharp citrus and fake cedar. "Listen to me very carefully, Clara," he hissed, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "My father is dead. His instructions do not matter anymore. I am the executor of this estate now. You are just a guest whose welcome is rapidly expiring. Now give me the key." "I do not have it," I lied, looking directly into his angry eyes. "Mr. Sterling took the only copy for security purposes. You can ask him for it when he arrives at 7:30. Vance glared at me for a long, tense moment. He was searching my face for any sign of weakness or deception. I gave him nothing. My expression was a mask of calm, quiet defiance. Finally, he scoffed, stepping back and straightening his cuffs. "Fine. I will get it from Sterling tonight. Enjoy your final few days of pretending you belong in this house, Clara, because by Monday morning, I want you packed and gone." He turned on his heel and walked away, barking at his daughters to go choose their bedrooms in the West Wing. I stood silently in the hallway, listening to their echoing laughter and the sound of doors slamming in a house that used to demand total peace. They were treating Cresthaven like a prize they had already won. I picked up their bags, dropped them haphazardly in the guest rooms, and walked down the back stairs to the kitchen. The stakes had never been clearer. Vance was not just going to sell the land. He was going to erase every memory of the man who built it. He had absolutely no respect for the blood and sweat poured into the foundation of this estate. I tied a canvas apron around my waist and began chopping vegetables for the roast. The rhythmic sound of the heavy knife hitting the wooden cutting board was the only sound in the massive kitchen. Every chop was a countdown. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times. 1 hour until dinner. 1 hour until Vance's fragile, arrogant world came crashing down around him. I just needed to maintain my discipline until Mr. Sterling walked through that door. Let the storm gather. I was ready. The grandfather clock struck 7, its deep, resonant chimes echoing through the quiet house. I untied my apron and smoothed the front of my black dress. The dining room table was set with grandfather's heavy silver cutlery and the pristine white china he only brought out for holidays. In the center, a large roasted chicken rested on a silver platter, surrounded by roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread. I stood by the swinging kitchen doors, watching as Uncle Vance, Lexi, and Mia entered the dining room. They did not pause to admire the craftsmanship of the long mahogany table or the intricate crystal chandelier hanging above it. Instead, Vance immediately pulled out the heavy carved chair at the head of the table, grandfather's chair, and sat down with a heavy sigh of satisfaction. "Well, it's about time," Vance muttered, unrolling a starched linen napkin and dropping it onto his lap. "Lexi, pour the wine. I brought a bottle of Bordeaux from the city. I am not drinking whatever cheap swill my father kept in that dusty cellar." I walked over to the sideboard and quietly began filling their water glasses. The tension in the room was palpable, but they were entirely oblivious to it. They were already celebrating their imaginary victory. "So, Clara," Vance started, leaning back in the heavy chair and resting his elbows on the table. The interrogation was beginning. "Have you started looking for a new place to live? I hear the rental market in town is pretty rough for someone with no actual job history." I carefully placed a warm basket of bread in the center of the table. "I have not started looking, Uncle Vance. I have been focused on managing the estate and finalizing the arrangements. Lexi snorted, taking a large sip of her wine. Managing the estate? You mean sweeping the floors and feeding his hunting dogs? You were a live-in nurse, Clara. Don't make it sound like you were running a corporation. Her words were meant to sting, a sharp jab at my pride. I simply nodded, stepping back toward the sideboard. I took care of him. That was my job. Vance chuckled, a low, patronizing sound that grated against my nerves. He cut a large piece of chicken and pointed his silver fork at me. And we are all very grateful for your service. Really, we are. But it's time to join the real world now. You can't hide in the woods forever, playing house with a dying old man. The casual cruelty of his words made my jaw tighten. He was dismissing the last 5 years of my life, the sacrifices I made, and the grueling discipline it took to keep this estate running while he ignored our phone calls. I was not hiding, I replied softly, my voice calm but firm. I was honoring his legacy. Someone had to. Vance slammed his fork down onto the porcelain plate. The sharp clatter made Mia jump. The pleasant facade of the dinner was gone, replaced by naked hostility. He hated being reminded of his absence. Legacy? Vance spat, his face reddening. His legacy was hoarding wealth while his own son struggled to build a business in the city. He was a stubborn, miserly old fool who cared more about these stupid pine trees than his own flesh and blood. And you? You were just a convenient pawn. You thought if you wiped his chin long enough, he would leave you a crumb of this empire. It's pathetic. He was belittling the only man who ever truly cared for me. He was tearing down the respect that was the foundation of Cresthaven. Grandfather believed in earning what you keep, I said, stepping closer to the table, my eyes locked directly on Vance. He believed in discipline. He did not hand out rewards to people who only showed up when it was time to collect. Vance stood up abruptly, his heavy chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He was towering over the table, his face twisted in fury. You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat. I am the executor. I am the sole heir to the Cresthaven fortune. And the first thing I am going to do on Monday morning is have security escort you off my property with nothing but the clothes on your back. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single copper coin. He slammed it down onto the mahogany table and pushed it forcefully across the polished wood. There you go, Clara, Vance sneered, his anger giving way to a cruel, triumphant grin. $1 single. That is your grand inheritance. Don't spend it all in one place. Maybe you can buy a cheap coffee on your way out tomorrow morning when the moving trucks arrive to pack up your little bedroom. The dining room fell completely silent. The only sound was the heavy breathing of my uncle and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My cousins were frozen, watching the drama unfold, stifling giggles behind their crystal wine glasses. I did not blink. I stared at the scarred copper coin resting next to my untouched porcelain saucer. The room was waiting for my tears, waiting for me to break under the weight of his cruelty. Instead, I reached out and picked up the dollar. I slid it into my apron pocket and looked my uncle dead in the eyes. I opened my mouth to deliver the truth that would shatter his entire world. But before I could speak a single word, the sharp, shrill ring of the front doorbell echoed through the silent manor. Vance's smug smile widened. Ah, that will be Mr. Sterling, right on time to make it official. He pointed a trembling finger at the swinging kitchen doors. Go let him in, Clara, and then you can go pack your bags. I turned away from the table, my heart pounding a steady, disciplined rhythm against my ribs. The climax had arrived. The storm was here, and Vance had no idea he was standing directly in its path. I walked out of the dining room and down the long, quiet hall toward the heavy front doors. I pulled open the heavy oak doors. Mr. Sterling stood on the stone porch, his black wool coat slick with mist. He carried a thick leather briefcase tightly under his arm. His expression was grim, his jaw set in a hard line. He stepped inside without a word, shaking the dampness from his shoulders as I quietly closed the door behind him. Is he in there? Mr. Sterling asked softly, nodding toward the dining room. Yes, I replied, my voice perfectly steady. He just offered me $1 single as my inheritance. The lawyer let out a short, dry scoff. Let's get this over with, Clara. I do not have the patience for his theatrics tonight. We walked side by side into the dining room. Vance had already poured himself another glass of wine and was leaning back in grandfather's chair, looking like a king waiting for his crown. Lexi and Mia sat up straighter, their eyes fixed hungrily on Mr. Sterling's briefcase. "Sterling, good to see you," Vance barked jovially, gesturing to an empty chair opposite him. "Have a seat. Let's skip the pleasantries and get right to the reading. I have developers coming back on Monday, and I need the title cleared immediately." Mr. Sterling did not sit down. He unclasped his briefcase with a loud, sharp click that echoed in the quiet room. He pulled out a single manila folder and rested it on the table. He looked at Vance, then at me, before clearing his throat. "Vance," Mr. Sterling began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We are here to discuss the final arrangements of your father's estate. As you are aware, your father amended his last will and testament precisely 3 years ago." Vance waved a dismissive hand. Yes. The outdated draft from his hospital stay a decade ago. It named me sole heir. Just read the formal paperwork so we can finalize the transfer." "That is exactly my point," Mr. Sterling continued, opening the folder. 3 years ago, your father revoked that draft. The final, legally binding will states the following regarding you, his only son. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and read directly from the document. "To my son, Vance, whose absence in my final years spoke louder than any words, I leave the sum of $1. This is to ensure there is no legal ambiguity regarding my intention to exclude him from the bulk of my estate." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the kitchen refrigerator through the swinging doors and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Vance's smug smile slowly melted off his face, replaced by a look of total, uncomprehending shock. He stared at Mr. Sterling, his mouth slightly open. Lexi lowered her wine glass, her eyes wide with panic. $1? Vance finally choked out, his voice cracking. "What kind of sick joke is this? He left me $1? Then who gets the house? Who gets the timber contracts?" He snapped his head toward me, his face flushing violently red. You poisoned his mind. You manipulated a dying old man to steal my inheritance." He slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, rattling the fine china. "I will tie this up in court for 10 years. You will never see a dime of this estate, Clara." I did not flinch. I stood calmly at the end of the table. "You cannot tie this up in probate court, Uncle Vance," I said softly, my voice cutting through his screaming. "Because the estate is not in the will." Vance froze, his fists still pressed against the wood. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Sterling pulled a second document from his briefcase, a thick stack of papers bound by a heavy blue ribbon. "Clara is correct. 2 years ago, your father executed an irrevocable living trust and a quitclaim deed. He legally transferred full ownership of Crest Haven, all surrounding timberlands, and all associated bank accounts entirely out of his name." The lawyer slid the heavy document across the table. It stopped right in front of Vance. "The estate is not a part of his inheritance," Mr. Sterling said flatly. "It already belongs to Clara. She is the sole owner, and has been for 24 months. Vance stared at the blue ribbon like it was a venomous snake. He shook his head aggressively. No, this is a forgery. This is a complete lie. My father would never hand over a multi-million-dollar empire to a 20-something nurse. Prove it. I want proof right now." I stepped forward. "You want proof, Uncle Vance? Fine." I walked over to the sideboard and picked up a heavy silver tray. I flipped it over. Engraved on the back were 6 numbers. "You spent all afternoon trying to guess the code to the master safe in the study. You thought it was your birth year. It wasn't." I looked him dead in the eyes. "The code is 4/1821, the exact date I moved into this house to take care of him when you stopped answering his calls." Vance's face went pale. He stumbled backward, knocking his chair into the wall. "And if you need more proof," I continued, reaching into my apron pocket. I pulled out a heavy, antique brass key, the only key to the study. I tossed it onto the table. It landed with a loud clatter next to the copper dollar he had given me. "I have the master deed right here," I said, pulling the folded parchment from my other pocket. I had retrieved it from the safe right before the appraisers arrived. I unfolded it and laid it next to his plate. "Signed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk." Vance stared at the signature. It was undeniably his father's sharp, disciplined handwriting. The reality of his absolute defeat finally crashed down upon him. He had nothing, no leverage, no legal standing, and no home. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at the man who had treated me like dirt for 5 years. He was completely broken by the very discipline he had spent his life running away from. The dining room felt as though all the air had been sucked out of it. Uncle Vance stood frozen against the wall, his chest heaving as he stared at the master deed. The crisp, official seal mocked his absolute certainty from just moments ago. Lexi and Mia exchanged panicked glances, their expensive phones completely forgotten on the mahogany table. This is impossible," Vance whispered, his voice completely hollow. He looked up at Mr. Sterling, desperation creeping into his eyes. "Sterling, tell me there is a clause. Tell me there is a loophole. You can't just let her take everything." Mr. Sterling slowly closed his leather briefcase, the sharp click echoing like a gavel striking a block. "There are no loopholes, Vance. The transfer was airtight. Your father was of sound mind, and he wanted his legacy in the hands of someone who actually respected it." Vance's legs seemed to give out. He slumped back into the heavy carved chair, staring blankly at the cold roast chicken. The grand celebration he had planned was over before it even began. I stood quietly at the end of the table, feeling the cold weight of the copper dollar in my apron pocket. I did not feel the fiery triumph I had imagined. I only felt a deep, profound sadness for a man who had squandered his family for the illusion of status. "Rank isn't the point, Uncle Vance," I said softly, breaking the suffocating silence. "Grandfather never cared about the money. He cared about the discipline it took to build this place. He cared about the respect required to maintain it. You came here today to tear it all down." Lexi abruptly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her haughty demeanor had completely vanished, replaced by a frantic, awkward backpedaling. "Clara, wait, let's not be hasty," she stammered, offering a tight, nervous smile. "We are family, right? My dad was just stressed about the funeral arrangements. We didn't mean any of those things we said earlier. We love Crest Haven, right, Mia?" Mia nodded vigorously, practically tripping over her words. "Oh, definitely. We were just joking about the developers. We would love to stay and help you manage the estate. You know, as partners." The sudden, desperate shift in their tone was almost comical. Less than an hour ago, they were treating me like a maid and picking out which bedrooms they were going to claim. Now, they were begging for scraps from the very person they had belittled. I looked at them, my expression unreadable. "You are welcome to stay for the weekend to attend the services," I said calmly. "But on Monday morning, you will pack your bags and leave. This house requires work, not partners who only show up when the check clears." Vance did not argue. He did not scream or threaten to sue. He simply buried his face in his hands, the fight completely drained from him. The rest of the weekend passed in a tense, disciplined quiet. The family attended grandfather's small private service at the local cemetery. Vance stood in the back, his head bowed, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Lexi and Mia wore oversized sunglasses, complaining quietly about the mud ruining their designer shoes. 3 days later, on a brisk Monday morning, I was in the library going over the weekly payroll for the grounds crew. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Uncle Vance stepped inside. He looked 10 years older, his custom-tailored suit was wrinkled, and the arrogant swagger was entirely gone from his posture. "Can I speak with you for a moment, Clara?" he asked, his voice rough and hesitant. I closed the ledger and folded my hands on the desk. "Of course. Have a seat." He slowly sat down in the leather armchair opposite me, staring at his hands. "The girls are packing the car," he began, unable to meet my eyes. "We will be out of your hair in an hour." I waited in silence. I knew this wasn't just a goodbye. Vance let out a long, heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. "I am bankrupt, Clara," he admitted, the words barely louder than a whisper. "My last 3 investments completely tanked. I leveraged everything I had to keep up appearances in the city. I was banking on this inheritance to save me from total ruin. That is why I was so desperate. That is why I sent the appraisers." He finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with a raw, ugly vulnerability. The pride that had defined his entire life was shattered. I was terrified of losing my status, and I took it out on you because you were the easy target. You were just the quiet girl in the woods. I looked at him, feeling a familiar calmness wash over me. Grandfather always said that true power did not need to punish the weak. It only needed to establish boundaries. I cannot fix your financial mistakes, Uncle Vance, I said firmly, my voice steady, and I will never let you sell a single acre of this estate to cover your debts. Vance nodded slowly, a tear slipping down his weathered cheek. I know. I understand. However, I continued, leaning forward slightly, Grandfather also taught me that family is complicated. I will not hand you a check. But if you are willing to actually work, I will hire you to manage the new timber contracts on the Western Ridge. You will report to Elias, the head groundskeeper. You will start at the bottom, and you will earn your keep. Vance stared at me, completely stunned. I was offering him a lifeline, but it required him to swallow the last shreds of his ego and work the very land he had despised. The open loop remained. Would he accept the discipline, or would his pride finally destroy him? A full week had passed since Mr. Sterling shattered the illusion of Uncle Vance's grand inheritance. The quiet rhythm of Cresthaven had slowly returned, but the dynamic had permanently shifted. The crisp autumn air carried the sharp scent of freshly cut pine from the Western Ridge. Elias, the head groundskeeper, had a new, surprisingly punctual assistant. It was Friday evening, exactly 7 days after the disastrous dinner. I sat in the Grand Library, reviewing the newly signed timber contracts, enjoying the profound peace of the estate. The heavy oak doors slowly pushed open. Uncle Vance stood in the threshold, but he looked completely different. He was not wearing a custom-tailored navy suit or reeking of sharp citrus cologne. Instead, he wore a faded, heavy canvas work jacket, one of Grandfather's old coats, and thick, mud-caked boots. His hands, previously soft and adorned with gold rings, were rough and stained with dirt and sap. "Dinner is ready, Clara," Vance said softly, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. I closed the ledger and followed him down the long, quiet hall toward the dining room. The table was set with simple, everyday plates. The heavy silver cutlery and pristine white china were safely packed away. This time, Vance did not sit at the head of the table in Grandfather's carved mahogany chair. He pulled out a seat halfway down the long table, waiting for me to sit down first. Lexi and Mia emerged from the swinging kitchen doors. They were not tapping frantically on their expensive phones or complaining about the cold drafts. They wore simple aprons over jeans and sweaters, carrying a steaming pot of stew and a basket of warm, crusty bread. They placed the food on the table quietly and sat down opposite me without a single word of complaint. The silence in the room was no longer suffocating or tense. It was a comfortable, respectful quiet. Vance served the stew, passing the bowls down the table. He paused, looking at his rough hands before looking up at me. His eyes were clear, entirely devoid of the arrogance that had defined him just a week ago. Elias said the western fencing is fully repaired, Vance started, his voice steady but humble. We cleared the fallen debris from the storm and reinforced the posts. The new timber crew arrives on Monday morning to start the selective harvesting. Thank you, Uncle Vance, I replied softly, taking a piece of bread. I appreciate the update. He nodded, staring down at his bowl. Clara, he began, his voice dropping slightly. I owe you a massive apology. Not just for last Friday, but for the last 5 years. I was entirely blinded by my own pride. I chased status in the city because I thought this place was beneath me. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. But I realize now that the discipline it takes to maintain this estate is far more valuable than any inheritance I thought I deserved. You earned this place. I did not. And I am deeply sorry for how I treated you. The sincerity in his voice was palpable. It was not a desperate plea for a bailout or an awkward attempt to backpedal. It was the honest admission of a broken man finally learning the meaning of respect. Apology accepted, I said quietly, offering him a small, genuine smile. Grandfather always believed that true strength was quiet. It does not need to shout, and it does not need to seek revenge. Lexi spoke up, her voice surprisingly soft. We actually like it here, Clara. The quiet is nice. We spent all afternoon helping Elias chop firewood. We want to stay and help, if you will have us. I looked around the table. They were finally learning the lessons grandfather had tried to teach them decades ago. They were learning the value of hard work, discipline, and respect. And they were learning it from the exact person they had spent 5 years underestimating. The rest of the dinner was peaceful. We talked about the estate, the upcoming winter preparations, and the memories of the man who had built it all. The storm had finally passed, and Crest Haven was stronger for it. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool, scarred surface of the copper dollar. I had not spent it. I kept it as a quiet reminder of the moment everything changed. A reminder that my worth was never defined by the opinions of people who only saw me as a servant. True power is not inherited, it is earned through discipline and care. And when the truth is finally revealed, the quietest voices echo the loudest. If this story reminded you of someone, or if you connected with Clara's quiet strength, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to follow along for more stories like this. Have you ever been underestimated before people knew your story? What did you do? Let me know in the comments below.